You learned from the previous lesson about the elements and breakdowns of communication. But in communication, there is always a process that is followed. Welcome to Oral Communication in Context. This is Lesson 3 of Unit 1, the Models of Communication. The best way to understand communication is to see it graphically. Many authors and researchers have come up with their own models based on what they want to emphasize as being an important component of communication. Let's start with the first model, the linear model. Linear models show one-way communication process. It is a straight path of relaying information, a one-directional, which means that the information from a sender is conveyed directly to the receiver. The role of the sender is to send a message, and the role of the receiver is to only receive the message. It does not have a feedback. It is good to use for audience persuasion and for propaganda setting. There is no concept of communication breakdown like noise. However, the communication is not continuous because it does not have the concept of feedback. Consider a speaker delivering a speech in front of an audience. The speaker is the sender, and he or she conveys his or her message directly to the audience, which are the receiver of the message. The audience simply listens and does not comment to the speaker. The following models are under the linear model. Let's start with the first one, Aristotle's model. The model focuses on the speaker. It describes a one-way interaction and is most applicable for public speaking. According to the model, communication starts when the speaker develops proof or argument used for persuasion. The proof will then be organized, written in the most convincing way, and then presented before an audience. The second one is the Shannon-Weaver's model. It is known as the mother of all communication models. The Shannon-Weaver model of 1949 depicts communication as a linear or one-way process consisting of 5 elements: a source, producer of message; a transmitter, encoder of message into signals; a channel, signals adapted for transmission; a receiver, decoder of message from the signal; and a destination. This model, however, has been criticized for missing one essential element in the communication process: the feedback. Without feedback, the speaker will not know whether the receiver understands the message or not. The third one is the Berlow's SMCR model. This model is proposed by David Berlow of 1960. It suggests elements on the communication process, namely the sender, message, channel, receiver. The elements interact with each other, and if one of these is not properly functioning, it can affect the whole process and can eventually lead to a failure of communication. This model focuses in the encoding and decoding, taking into account each factor to the 5 elements mentioned before. Let's move on to the second type of model, the interactive model. The models under interaction take into consideration feedback from the receiver. Thus, the message on these models originates from 2 sources: the message from the sender and the feedback from the receiver. When the receiver gives feedback, he or she becomes the sender, and the original sender becomes the receiver of the feedback. Your everyday conversations with your friends are good examples of the interaction models. One gives a message, the other receives it, and then gives feedback accordingly. It is important to know that feedback may come in many forms. Aside from the spoken words, feedback may be as simple as a nod of approval, a raised eyebrow, or even falling asleep during a lecture. There are several types of interactive model in their case. The first one is the Schramm's model. Wilbur Schramm, an expert and known as the father of mass communication, introduced the interactive model in 1954. Which was groundbreaking at the time since it introduced the communicators' fields of experience. Schramm also took into account context. Context refers to the setting in which the communication situation takes place, while fields of experience refer to the cultural background and other frames of experience that an individual may bring into the interaction. Field of experience is the very highlight of this model. Field of experience is everything that makes a person unique. everything he or she has ever learned, watched, seen, heard, read, and studied. In other words, it is everything a person has ever experienced or not experienced, done or not done. In fact, this is practically everything that has happened to his or her life. It is this field of experience that is used to interpret a message and create a response. It is also this field of experience of the listener that needs to overlap with the speaker's field of experience, which can only happen when the two fields have commonalities. For example, the teacher must deliver his or her lecture in either English or Filipino because that is the language that students know and use. If the teacher suddenly started using Chinese in the lecture, the students will not understand a single thing. The teacher may perhaps be understood if he or she was teaching in Chinese school. Scrum's model shows a cycle of communication process between the encoder and the decoder who shift roles as the messages are exchanged. The decoder provides feedback as soon as the message is understood and a response is formed. In giving feedback, he or she becomes the sender and the original sender becomes the receiver. In this model, since the message is being decoded and understood by both communicators, they are both marked as interpreters. The second one for the interactive model is the White's model. This model was developed by Eugene White, who tells that communication is circular and continuous, without a beginning or end. This is why he made a cyclical model. He points out that although we can assume that communication begins with thinking, communication can actually be observed from any point in the circle. Eugene White contributed the concept of feedback on the field of communication. Feedback is the perception of the speaker about the response of the listener. The speaker can only receive feedback if the speaker is monitoring the listener. The speaker will know what the listener's response is only if he or she is paying attention. Now let's move on to the third type of model, the transactional model. This model, developed in 1970s by Dean Barland, shows communication as occurring continuously and simultaneously between or among people. It shows communication as a two-way process in which participants are constantly sending and receiving messages. According to Barland, people do not simply send and receive messages and send them back again in that order. Instead, they send and receive messages simultaneously and build shared meanings during the interaction. Furthermore, the channel used, the environment, the communicators themselves, their shared meanings, and even noise are part of the message, not just elements involved in the communication process. In addition, the transactional model is now more than just something taking place in the channel. Instead, noise is found or occurs at any part of any point in the process. It could be found in the source, the encoding process, the channel, the decoding process, the receiver, and the feedback. And that's it for today's lesson. I'll see you again on our next lecture.